The courtroom, bathed in the muted glow of fluorescent lights, carried a palpable tension. Judge Richard Crawford sat at the high bench, his imposing figure framed by the rich mahogany backdrop. The lines on his weathered face told stories of decades spent wrestling with the law, his deep-set eyes scanning the courtroom with a practiced neutrality. It was just another day of routine cases. Or so he thought. "Next case," Judge Crawford called, his voice steady but edged with weariness. The clerk's voice rang out, introducing the defendant. Case number 1824, Melanie Brooks, charged with petty theft. A slender woman in her late 20s shuffled forward, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Her dark hair was pulled into a haphazard bun, and her clothes, though clean, bore signs of wear. Her eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on the floor. Melanie's public defender, a lanky man named Alan Reed, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client is accused of taking expired items from the Greenfield Market on Elm Street." "Expired items?" Crawford's tone held a note of curiosity. "Yes, Your Honor," Reed confirmed. "The goods in question were past their sell-by date and had been discarded by the store. My client was attempting to feed her family, her daughter specifically. They're experiencing extreme financial hardship." Judge Crawford's gaze shifted to Melanie, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, "do you have anything you'd like to say?" Melanie hesitated, her hands gripping the edges of the defendant's podium. Her voice, trembling but resolute, filled the courtroom. "Your Honor, I didn't mean to steal, but my daughter Naomi, she hasn't eaten in 2 days. I couldn't stand to see her cry anymore." The room fell silent. From the gallery, whispers subsided into a heavy stillness. Crawford observed the young mother, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the faint tremble in her hands. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was a mother fighting against despair. "Mrs. Brooks," Crawford said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "The law is clear about theft, but tell me, why didn't you seek help from local charities or food banks?" Melanie's voice cracked as she replied, "I did, Your Honor. The food banks were out of supplies. I tried everywhere, but—" Her voice broke, and she took a deep breath to steady herself. "It's just me and Naomi. Her father, he's gone, and I couldn't watch her suffer anymore." Before Crawford could respond, a small voice piped up from the gallery. "We were hungry." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. All eyes turned toward a little girl with wide brown eyes and a timid posture. She couldn't have been older than 7. "Naomi," Melanie whispered, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and panic. Crawford leaned forward, his stern gaze meeting the child's. "Young lady, who are you?" "I'm Naomi," she said boldly, her voice clear despite her small stature. "She's my mom." Naomi pointed at Melanie, her expression defiant. Judge Crawford exhaled deeply, his stern demeanor faltering. "Naomi, it's not appropriate to speak out in court." "But I'm hungry," Naomi blurted out. The raw honesty of her words sent a ripple through the room. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Melanie's shoulders sagged, her head bowing as silent tears spilled down her cheeks. Crawford's chest tightened. For a man who had presided over countless cases, this moment struck a nerve he hadn't felt in years. He observed Naomi's scuffed shoes, her oversized sweater, and the resilience burning in her young eyes. His gaze returned to Melanie, who now clung to the edge of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The judge leaned back, interlocking his fingers. "This court will take a brief recess," he announced abruptly, standing and stepping away from the bench. The room erupted into murmurs as spectators speculated about his sudden departure. Judge Crawford retreated to his chambers, his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the image of Naomi, hungry yet unbroken. Memories of his own childhood surfaced, moments when his family had barely scraped by during tough times. Those struggles had shaped the man he became, but they hadn't been fair. And now, here was another family, caught in the same cycle of despair. He opened his desk drawer, retrieving his wallet. He took out a few bills, pausing as doubt flickered across his face. Was this the right way to help? Would it even make a difference? After a moment's hesitation, he placed the money back in his wallet and instead reached for his coat. The courtroom hushed as Judge Crawford returned, this time carrying a paper bag. He approached the defense table, his black robe billowing slightly as he moved. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I thought you might need this." He handed the bag to her. Melanie hesitated, her hands trembling as she accepted the unexpected offering. Inside were 2 sandwiches, a couple of apples, and bottles of water. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor." Naomi's face lit up. "Can we eat now?" she asked, her voice full of hopeful innocence. Crawford nodded. "Please, go ahead." The room remained silent as mother and daughter ate. Spectators exchanged stunned glances, and even the court reporter paused in her note-taking. The prosecutor, visibly uncomfortable, shuffled his papers. Meanwhile, Alan Reed leaned back in his chair, a faint smile of approval on his lips. Judge Crawford returned to his seat, watching the pair as they finished their modest meal. The weight of his role bore down on him in a way it hadn't before. He realized that justice, though often bound by laws, also required humanity. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, his tone measured, "theft is a crime, and this court doesn't take that lightly. However—" He paused, the room holding its collective breath. "Given the circumstances, I believe incarceration is not an appropriate solution." Melanie stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. Naomi clutched her mother's hand tightly. "I'm sentencing you to 30 hours of community service at the Springfield Food Bank," Crawford continued. "There you can assist others facing similar challenges. In addition, this court will work with local organizations to provide support for you and your daughter." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Crawford silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel. He stood, his gaze meeting Melanie's. "This is not just a sentence, Mrs. Brooks. It's an opportunity. Don't waste it." Melanie's legs trembled as she and Naomi exited the courtroom. The judgment wasn't what she had expected, certainly not what she had feared. Outside the courthouse, the cool air brushed against their faces, bringing a sense of clarity. Melanie clutched Naomi's hand tightly as they walked down the stone steps. "Mommy, does this mean you're not going to jail?" Naomi asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. Melanie knelt to Naomi's height, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's right, sweetheart. We're staying together." Naomi threw her small arms around her mother's neck, clinging to her as if letting go might change everything. Melanie kissed her daughter's forehead, silently vowing to do whatever it took to keep her promise. Inside the courthouse, Judge Crawford remained seated at the bench, reflecting on what had just transpired. The courtroom had emptied, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His clerk, Marissa, entered hesitantly, a stack of paperwork in her hands. "Judge Crawford," she began, her tone laced with uncertainty, "there's already talk spreading about your decision today." Crawford looked up, his expression unreadable. "What kind of talk?" Marissa hesitated. "Some are saying it was unconventional. Others are calling it compassionate. The prosecutor seemed displeased, but a few public defenders said it's about time someone in your position did something like this." Crawford nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "Let them talk, Marissa. Justice isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about doing what's right." Marissa smiled faintly, placing the papers on his desk. "For what it's worth, sir, I think you did the right thing." He offered her a small, grateful nod. But even as she left, the weight of the case lingered in the judge's mind. He couldn't shake the image of Naomi's small face or Melanie's desperate plea. For the first time in his career, Crawford questioned whether the rigid framework of the law truly served the people it claimed to protect. The following Monday, Melanie arrived at the Springfield Food Bank as directed. The facility was bustling with activity. Volunteers sorted through boxes of canned goods, and a line of families waited patiently outside for their turn to receive supplies. A middle-aged woman with a kind smile approached Melanie. "You must be Mrs. Brooks. I'm Ellen, the volunteer coordinator here." Melanie nodded nervously. "Yes, that's me. I'm here to start my community service." Ellen placed a reassuring hand on Melanie's shoulder. "We're glad to have you. Let me show you around." As Ellen led Melanie through the food bank, explaining how donations were sorted and distributed, Melanie couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. She'd been on the receiving end of such services before, but now she was on the other side, offering help to others. It was a humbling experience. By midday, Melanie found herself sorting through crates of fresh produce. She wiped her brow, glancing at the other volunteers around her. Most were retirees or local students fulfilling service requirements. None of them seemed to judge her, which eased the tension she'd carried since arriving. During her break, Melanie wandered to the seating area, where she spotted Ellen talking to a group of volunteers. As Melanie approached, Ellen waved her over. "Melanie," Ellen said warmly, "I was just telling everyone about the extra help we've been getting thanks to the judge's initiative. It's making a big difference." Melanie blinked in surprise. "The judge's initiative?" Ellen nodded. "Judge Crawford has been a quiet supporter of this food bank for years. He helps secure grants and even volunteers occasionally. Didn't you know?" Melanie shook her head, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and newfound respect for the judge. She realized that his kindness extended far beyond her case. Back at the courthouse, Judge Crawford sifted through another stack of case files. Each name represented a person with their own struggles and hardships. His approach to justice had always been methodical, but recent events had ignited a deeper sense of purpose. Crawford paused as he reached Melanie's file, his thoughts drifting to her husband. The man had been convicted of armed robbery years ago, but something about the case details nagged at him. The evidence had been circumstantial, and the timeline of events didn't fully align. He set the file aside and picked up his phone. "Marissa," he called to his clerk, "get me everything we have on the Brooks case. Trial transcripts, police reports, everything." The next few days were a blur of late nights and endless reading. Crawford pored over witness statements, cross-referenced timelines, and flagged inconsistencies in the evidence. The deeper he delved, the more convinced he became that justice hadn't been served. Weeks passed, and Melanie began to find a sense of purpose in her work at the food bank. Naomi often accompanied her after school, happily chatting with the other volunteers. The once dreary apartment began to feel brighter, filled with hope rather than despair. One afternoon, as Melanie stacked crates of canned goods, Ellen approached with a smile. "Melanie, we're starting a new program for single parents, and I think you'd be a great fit to help run it." Melanie blinked in surprise. "Me? But I'm just—" "Someone who knows what it's like," Ellen interrupted gently. "That's exactly what we need." Tears pricked Melanie's eyes as she nodded. "I'd be honored." Meanwhile, Judge Crawford made a discovery that left him shaken. A police report, buried in the case files, mentioned a potential suspect who had never been investigated. The man had an extensive criminal record and had been spotted near the scene of the robbery the same night Melanie's husband was arrested. Yet, for reasons unclear, the lead had been dropped. Crawford knew he couldn't let this stand. He reached out to an old friend, Sarah Coleman, a seasoned attorney who specialized in wrongful convictions. "Richard," Sarah said after reviewing the files he sent, "there's more than enough here to reopen the case. But you realize this won't be easy. There'll be pushback." "I don't care," Crawford replied firmly. "It's the right thing to do." News of Crawford's investigation into the Brooks case spread quickly. Some praised him for his commitment to justice, while others accused him of overstepping his bounds. Protests erupted outside the courthouse with signs bearing slogans like "Justice for All" and "Stick to the Law." Crawford faced the scrutiny with quiet resolve. He attended every hearing, presenting the evidence he had uncovered with unshakable determination. Sarah's fiery arguments in court further bolstered their case. Months later, the verdict came. Melanie's husband's conviction was overturned. evidence against the alternate suspect had been uncovered, leading to a confession that exonerated him. The courtroom erupted in applause as Melanie wept openly, clutching Naomi in her arms. Outside, reporters swarmed Crawford, but he waved them off. His work wasn't for headlines. It was for the family he had helped reunite. Judge Richard Crawford sat quietly in his chambers, staring at the mound of paperwork scattered across his desk. His thoughts were not on the legal briefs before him, but on the case he had presided over just days ago. The image of Melanie Brooks and her young daughter Naomi haunted him, their faces etched with desperation and hunger. He had faced countless defendants in his career, but this case felt different. It lingered, gnawing at the corners of his conscience. Crawford was a man of the law, steadfast and unyielding, but for the first time he wondered if the law alone was enough. Melanie's case had struck a chord with the town as well. Conversations about it spilled into coffee shops, diners, and living rooms, dividing the community. Some praised Judge Crawford for his compassion, calling him a rare example of justice tempered with humanity. Others criticized him for showing favoritism and undermining the rule of law. The courthouse buzzed with gossip and speculation, whispers echoing in its marble corridors. Judge Patricia Harding, one of Crawford's colleagues, approached him one morning, her expression tight with concern. "Richard, the Judicial Review Board has called for an investigation into your conduct," she said, handing him an official notice. Crawford scanned the document, his jaw tightening. The board was questioning his impartiality, citing his personal involvement with the Brooks family. In the days following the verdict, Melanie Brooks reported to the Springfield Food Bank as part of her court-ordered community service. The experience was humbling, but transformative. Surrounded by volunteers who welcomed her without judgment, Melanie began to feel a glimmer of hope. Ellen, the food bank's coordinator, took Melanie under her wing, encouraging her to take an active role. Melanie worked tirelessly, sorting donations and assisting families in need. Naomi often accompanied her after school, her infectious energy brightening the somber atmosphere. For the first time in years, their lives felt less like survival and more like progress. Judge Crawford couldn't shake the feeling that the Brooks family deserved more than what the legal system had offered. One evening, he requested the complete case file of Melanie's husband, Darren Brooks, who had been convicted of armed robbery 2 years prior. Darren's imprisonment had set off the chain of events that led Melanie to steal discarded food for Naomi. Crawford meticulously combed through every page, growing increasingly unsettled. Key witness testimonies were vague, and the timeline of events was riddled with inconsistencies. A police report buried in the file mentioned another suspect, a man with a criminal record who had been in the area at the time of the crime. Yet, this lead had never been pursued. Crawford's unease grew. He reached out to Sarah Coleman, a respected attorney and an old friend from law school who specialized in wrongful convictions. He explained his concerns and shared the case file. Sarah reviewed the documents with a sharp eye, her expression growing more serious with each page. "Richard," she said, her voice resolute, "there's enough here to reopen the case. But you know this won't be simple. People will question your motives, especially with everything happening around Melanie's case." Crawford nodded. "I don't care about the optics, Sarah. If there's a chance Darren Brooks was wrongfully convicted, we owe it to him, and to his family, to get this right." While Crawford and Sarah began the arduous process of filing a motion to reopen Darren's case, Melanie's life took a surprising turn. Ellen approached her with an offer. The food bank was launching a program to support single parents, and Ellen wanted Melanie to help lead it. Melanie was taken aback. "Me? Lead a program?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Ellen smiled warmly. "You understand what these families are going through because you've lived it. That kind of experience is invaluable." Tears welled in Melanie's eyes as she nodded, overwhelmed by the opportunity. News of Crawford's involvement in Darren's case spread quickly. The town was already abuzz with debates about his decision in Melanie's trial, and this new development only intensified the scrutiny. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, some holding signs that read, justice for all, and impartiality matters. Inside, Crawford faced mounting pressure from his peers and the Judicial Review Board. Accusations of bias and overreach threatened to tarnish his decades-long career. Still, he pressed on, driven by a conviction that justice required more than blind adherence to procedure. The legal battle to reopen Darren's case was grueling. Sarah worked tirelessly, building a compelling argument that highlighted the flaws in the original trial. Crawford attended every hearing, presenting the evidence he had uncovered with quiet determination. Each court session was a crucible, testing his resolve and his belief in the system he had served for so long. Months passed before a breakthrough finally came. The court granted the motion to reopen Darren's case, citing the new evidence as grounds for a retrial. As Darren's retrial approached, Melanie juggled her responsibilities at the food bank with preparing Naomi for the changes ahead. Naomi was ecstatic at the thought of seeing her father again, peppering Melanie with questions about when he would come home. Melanie, however, carried a quiet anxiety. She feared the possibility of another disappointment, another blow to their fragile hope. But she remained steadfast, determined to support Darren no matter the outcome. The retrial was a turning point, not just for the Brooks family, but for the entire town. Sarah's cross-examination of witnesses revealed glaring inconsistencies, and the introduction of the alternate suspect's confession shattered the prosecution's case. Darren was exonerated. The courtroom erupted in applause as the judge declared him a free man. Melanie sobbed openly, clutching Naomi as Darren walked toward them, his own tears streaming down his face. They embraced, their family finally whole after years of separation. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Crawford, eager for a statement. He raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "Today is not about me," he said firmly. "It's about justice, real justice for a family that has endured unimaginable hardship. This case reminds us all that the law must serve the people, not the other way around." In the weeks that followed, Crawford's actions continued to spark debate, but they also inspired change. Community leaders began discussions on reforming local policies to better support families in crisis. Melanie's leadership at the food bank flourished, and Darren found work at a local construction company eager to give him a second chance. Naomi, now surrounded by both her parents, thrived in school, her once timid demeanor replaced by a newfound confidence. Judge Crawford, though bruised by the criticism and scrutiny, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that his role was not just to interpret the law, but to ensure it served the people it was meant to protect. As he sat in his chambers late one evening, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice, he realized, was not a static concept bound by rigid rules. It was a living, breathing ideal, one that required courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Darren Brooks sat at the edge of the small bed in the halfway house where he was staying temporarily after his release. His hands rested on his knees as he stared out of the narrow window, the muted light of the early evening casting long shadows across the room. Though free, the weight of the years he had spent in prison hung heavily on him. Every sound, every moment of quiet, felt foreign. The world outside had moved on, leaving him to catch up. Yet there was a spark of hope in the knowledge that his family was waiting for him. A family he had been ripped away from, but now had the chance to rebuild with patience and love. Melanie had insisted on taking things slowly. While she was overjoyed to have Darren back, she knew their reunion wouldn't instantly erase the pain of the past or the challenges ahead. She wanted Naomi to adjust gradually, to rediscover the father she had been separated from for so long. In those first few weeks, they spent quiet afternoons in the park or at home, where Naomi would share stories about her school and show Darren her drawings. Darren, awkward at first, slowly found his footing. He began helping Naomi with her homework, his rough hands carefully turning the pages of her school books, his deep voice filling the room as he read aloud. Meanwhile, Melanie's role at the food bank grew into something she could never have imagined. Ellen, ever the mentor, encouraged her to share her story at local community events. At first, Melanie was hesitant. She wasn't accustomed to speaking publicly, much less sharing the details of her personal struggles. But when she stood in front of her first audience, her voice shaking, something remarkable happened. As she spoke about her journey, from her husband's wrongful imprisonment to her arrest and Judge Crawford's unexpected kindness, she saw the faces in the crowd soften. Some nodded in understanding, while others wiped away tears. By the end, the applause was thunderous, and Melanie felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't known was possible. Judge Crawford continued to face backlash from certain corners of the community. Anonymous letters arrived at his office, some accusing him of favoritism, others of undermining the law. One morning, he found a note taped to his car windshield that read, "Judges should judge, not save." He pocketed the note without a word and drove to the courthouse, his expression as unreadable as ever. He didn't discuss these attacks with anyone, not even Marissa, his loyal clerk. But each time he looked at the letters or thought of the protests outside the courthouse, he reminded himself of Naomi's voice in the courtroom that day. "I'm hungry." Those words had cut through every legal doctrine he had ever followed, grounding him in a humanity that could not be ignored. Crawford's dedication to fairness began to influence his decisions in other cases. He found himself digging deeper into the circumstances of each defendant, questioning the systemic factors that brought them to his courtroom. His rulings became known for their balance of accountability and compassion, earning him respect from many who had once doubted his methods. Younger judges sought his guidance, asking how he managed to walk the fine line between the law and empathy. To each of them, Crawford would respond with the same advice. Listen. Not just to the words, but to what they mean. Justice doesn't live in silence. It lives in the stories people bring before us. Naomi, for her part, began to flourish in ways that surprised even her teachers. With Darren back in her life and Melanie more confident than ever, Naomi thrived in school. She joined the art club and started participating in the school's community service projects, often helping at the same food bank where her mother worked. One day, during a class presentation about heroes, Naomi stood up in front of her peers and spoke proudly about her parents. "My mom and dad are my heroes because they never gave up, even when life was really hard," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Melanie, who had been invited to watch, wiped away tears as the class erupted in applause. Darren's journey back into the workforce was not without its challenges. Employers were wary of hiring someone with a criminal record, despite his exoneration. But the community, inspired by Melanie's story and Judge Crawford's advocacy, rallied around him. A local contractor named Tom, who had attended one of Melanie's talks, offered Darren a position. It started with small tasks, carrying materials, cleaning up job sites. But Darren approached each assignment with diligence and gratitude. Within months, he had earned Tom's trust and was promoted to a full-time carpenter. The steady work provided not only financial stability, but also a renewed sense of purpose. In the midst of these changes, Judge Crawford made a decision that would alter his career. After months of reflection and conversations with his family, he announced that he would not seek re-election when his term ended. Instead, he planned to dedicate his time to reforming the very systems he had once upheld. The news sent shockwaves through the legal community. Some saw it as a loss of a steadfast figure in the judiciary, while others viewed it as a bold step forward. Crawford himself felt a mix of apprehension and resolve. He had spent decades behind the bench, but now he wanted to work on preventing the injustices that brought people there in the first place. His first initiative was the creation of a task force to address wrongful convictions in the state. Partnering with Sarah Coleman and other legal experts, he sought to identify cases where bias, negligence, or systemic flaws had led to unjust outcomes. The task force garnered significant attention, drawing support from advocacy groups and even some state legislators. Crawford's reputation as a fair and thorough judge lent credibility to the initiative, and soon, it became a model for similar programs nationwide. Melanie and Darren became active participants in Crawford's efforts, sharing their story at public forums and working with organizations that supported families affected by wrongful imprisonment. Their resilience and dedication inspired countless others, turning them into local heroes. Melanie's leadership at the food bank expanded into a broader role as an advocate for food security, while Darren began mentoring young men in the community, encouraging them to pursue opportunities and avoid the pitfalls that had once ensnared him. The Brooks family's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Their small apartment, once a place of struggle and despair, became a home filled with laughter and hope. They celebrated milestones together: Naomi's first art exhibit, Darren's promotion to lead carpenter, Melanie's recognition as a community leader. Each step forward felt like a victory against the forces that had once tried to tear them apart. For Judge Crawford, the Brooks family symbolized everything he had come to believe about justice: that it was not merely about punishment, but about restoration and redemption. On the day of his retirement, a small ceremony was held in the courthouse. Colleagues, former defendants, and community members gathered to honor his service. Among them were Melanie, Darren, and Naomi. As Crawford stood to speak, he looked out at the crowd, his gaze lingering on the Brooks family. "In my years as a judge," he began, "I've learned that the law is a tool, a powerful one, but it is not infallible. It is our duty, as custodians of justice, to ensure that the law serves the people, not the other way around. The Brooks family taught me that justice without compassion is incomplete, and for that lesson, I am forever grateful." As the audience erupted into applause, Crawford stepped down from the podium. Melanie approached him, her hand outstretched. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice filled with emotion. Naomi, now taller and more confident, hugged the judge tightly. "You saved us," she whispered. As Crawford walked out of the courthouse for the last time, the sun casting long shadows across the steps, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His work was far from over, but the path ahead was clear. Justice, he now understood, was a living, breathing endeavor, one that required constant vigilance, boundless empathy, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The years that followed marked profound changes not just for the Brooks family, but for the entire community. Darren, Melanie, and Naomi became symbols of resilience, a family that had faced unimaginable hardship, yet emerged stronger, more united, and more determined to help others in similar situations. Their story resonated far beyond the small town where it all began, inspiring others to examine the deeper issues within the justice system and their communities. Darren's work as a carpenter flourished. His dedication and skill earned him a reputation for excellence, and soon he was leading his own team at the construction company. His work took him to schools, community centers, and even low-income housing projects. Each nail he hammered, each plank he cut, felt like another step toward rebuilding not just his life, but the lives of others who had suffered as he once had. Darren also volunteered his weekends mentoring young men at the community center, sharing his story and encouraging them to stay on a path that would lead to opportunities rather than obstacles. Melanie's role at the food bank grew into a full-time position as a community outreach coordinator. She worked tirelessly to expand their programs, ensuring that no family in the area went hungry. Her own experience with food insecurity fueled her passion, and her ability to connect with people on a deeply personal level made her a natural leader. Melanie often found herself speaking at events, advocating for policy changes that would provide better support for struggling families. Her voice, once quiet and uncertain, now carried with it the weight of lived experience and unwavering determination. Naomi thrived in ways that surprised even her parents. The shy, reserved girl who had once spoken up in a courtroom out of sheer hunger now stood confidently in school debates and excelled in her art classes. Her drawings, once confined to scraps of paper at the kitchen table, began to win awards in local competitions. One of her pieces, a vivid portrayal of a mother and child walking hand in hand, was chosen to hang in the town hall. "It's about me and Mom," Naomi explained to a reporter at the unveiling, her voice clear and proud. and about how we always stuck together, no matter what. The Brooks family's story reached beyond the local community. Melanie was invited to speak at statewide conferences, and Darren was asked to join an advisory board focused on re-entry programs for formerly incarcerated individuals. Together, they became powerful advocates for systemic change. They shared their story with lawmakers, educators, and business leaders, urging them to consider the human cost of a system that too often prioritized punishment over rehabilitation or fairness. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to make an impact. Judge Crawford, now retired from the bench, dedicated himself fully to the task force he had established. The initiative expanded rapidly, uncovering cases of wrongful convictions and helping secure the release of several individuals who had been imprisoned unjustly. Crawford traveled across the state, meeting with judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys to promote reforms aimed at preventing such injustices from occurring in the first place. His name became synonymous with justice tempered by compassion, and his work inspired a new generation of legal professionals. Despite the accolades and growing recognition, Crawford remained grounded. He often returned to the community where it all began, visiting the food bank to see Melanie and sometimes attending events at the community center where Darren mentored young men. He maintained a close bond with the Brooks family, quietly supporting them in their efforts to make a difference. One spring afternoon, as Crawford sat on a bench in the park where he often came to reflect, Naomi approached him, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She was taller now, her once round face beginning to take on the angular features of adolescence, but her bright eyes were the same. "Judge Crawford," she said, sitting beside him, "can I show you something?" He smiled warmly. "Of course, Naomi. What have you got there?" She opened her sketchbook to a drawing that took Crawford's breath away. It depicted a courtroom, but instead of the usual stark imagery of defendants and lawyers, it showed a judge handing a paper bag to a mother and her child. The mother's face was etched with relief, while the child's eyes shone with gratitude. Above the scene, Naomi had written in bold letters, "Justice is kindness in action." Crawford's throat tightened as he studied the drawing. "This is beautiful, Naomi," he said softly. "You've captured something very special here." Naomi beamed. "I wanted to say thank you for everything you did for us, for my mom, my dad, and me." Crawford placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, Naomi. You and your family taught me just as much as I've taught you. Maybe more." As Naomi walked away, her sketchbook under her arm, Crawford sat back and watched the world around him. Families played on the swings, couples strolled hand in hand, and children laughed as they chased each other across the grass. He thought about how much had changed since that day in the courtroom, how one case had transformed not only his career, but his entire perspective on life. Years later, the ripple effects of the Brooks family's story could still be felt. The food bank had expanded its reach, now serving multiple counties thanks to Melanie's tireless advocacy. Darren had started his own construction business, employing men and women who had struggled to find work after incarceration. Naomi, now a young woman, pursued a degree in social work, determined to help families like her own navigate the challenges of poverty and systemic injustice. Judge Crawford's task force had become a national model, sparking similar initiatives across the country. Though his name often appeared in articles and on the lips of those discussing legal reform, Crawford remained humble. For him, the work was not about recognition, but about creating a system where stories like the Brooks families were no longer necessary, because the system itself worked to support, not punish, those in need. On the day of his 80th birthday, the Brooks family surprised Crawford with a small gathering at the community center. As he entered the room, the sound of laughter and applause greeted him. Darren handed him a plaque that read, "In gratitude to Judge Richard Crawford for turning justice into hope." Crawford, rarely one for displays of emotion, felt his eyes mist as he accepted the plaque. He looked around the room at the faces of those he had touched and those who had touched him in return. Melanie stood beside Darren, their arms around Naomi, who now towered over her mother. Ellen was there, along with many of the people Crawford had worked with over the years. It was a testament not just to his impact, but to the collective strength of a community that had come together to make a difference. As the celebration wound down, Crawford stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the town he had served for so many years. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the choices he had made, and the lessons he had learned along the way. For Judge Richard Crawford, justice had never been about the letter of the law alone. It had been about listening, understanding, and acting with compassion. It had been about seeing the humanity in every case, every person, every story. And as he stood there, the sounds of laughter and life drifting out from the community center behind him, Crawford knew that, in the end, justice had truly been served. Judge Whitman sat in his chambers, his mind buzzing with the consequences of his actions. His years on the bench, his reputation, and everything he'd worked for hung precariously in the balance. Patricia's warning about the investigation had been clear. His involvement in the Thomas family's case was being scrutinized, and the outcome could be devastating. Yet, the thought of stepping back, of abandoning Sheila and Naomi to the mercy of a flawed system, was unthinkable. Justice, he reasoned, was not merely about following rules. It was about doing what was right, even when it came at great personal cost. The courthouse noises faded into a distant hum as Whitman leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. He had always believed in the law's capacity to serve justice, but this case had exposed cracks he could no longer ignore. The Thomas family's plight was emblematic of something much larger, a system that, in its pursuit of order, often overlooked the humanity of those it judged. It was this humanity, raw, desperate, and unyielding, that Whitman had seen in Naomi's innocent plea, "I'm hungry." He could not turn his back on them now, no matter the consequences. Late into the night, Whitman worked tirelessly, his study illuminated by a single desk lamp. Dusty case files and faded police reports cluttered his desk as he searched for every detail that could strengthen his belief in Mr. Thomas's innocence. The deeper he delved, the clearer the inconsistencies became. Witness testimonies conflicted with the official police report. Key pieces of evidence had been ignored or dismissed. Patterns of racial bias were disturbingly apparent, hinting at a rushed conviction rather than a fair trial. Whitman's resolve deepened as he pieced together the troubling puzzle. One evening, as the clock struck midnight, Whitman's tired eyes caught an inconsistency in a witness statement that he had read several times before. Marita Johnson, a key witness for the prosecution, had described the scene of the crime in detail, but her account didn't match the physical evidence recorded by the police. Whitman's heart raced. Could this discrepancy be the break he needed? He grabbed the phone and made a discreet call to a private investigator he trusted. "I need you to find Marita Johnson," he said in a low voice. Her testimony in the Thomas case could hold the key to the truth. Days turned into weeks as Whitman pressed on, undeterred by the whispers and judgmental glances from his colleagues. The scrutiny was intense, but it only strengthened his determination. The private investigator's call finally came on a rainy afternoon. "I found her," the voice said on the other end. "She's willing to talk." Whitman immediately arranged a meeting, careful to keep it off the official record. If Marita's story corroborated his suspicions, it could be the turning point they so desperately needed. Marita Johnson sat across from Whitman in a dimly lit cafe, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. Her eyes, filled with regret, avoided his gaze. "I've carried this guilt for years," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what really happened that night, but I was scared. The police pressured me to go along with their version of events." As Marita recounted the events of that fateful night, Whitman felt a mix of anger and hope. Her account painted a damning picture of misconduct and coercion. Her testimony, combined with the other evidence he had uncovered, could form a compelling case to reopen the trial. Back at his office, Whitman meticulously compiled the new evidence. Witness statements, police reports, and Marita's testimony were carefully documented and cross-referenced. Each page added to the growing stack of files on his desk, a physical representation of his relentless pursuit of justice. As the case grew stronger, so did Whitman's resolve. He knew the risks, but the thought of abandoning Sheila and Naomi was unbearable. The next day, Sheila paced nervously outside Whitman's office. She had heard the rumors swirling around the courthouse, whispers of the judge's alleged misconduct and the investigation into his actions. Her heart raced as she knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Whitman's voice called from inside. As Sheila entered, she saw the exhaustion etched into his face. His eyes were shadowed with fatigue, but his expression softened when he saw her. "Mrs. Thomas, please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair. Sheila sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Judge Whitman," she began hesitantly, "I need to know, why are you doing all this for us?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes searching his for answers. "People are talking. They're saying you've gone too far. I'm grateful, truly, but I'm scared. What if this makes things worse for us?" Whitman leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Thomas," he said slowly, "I've spent my life upholding the law. But this case has shown me that the law isn't always enough. Justice isn't just about rules and procedures, it's about doing what's right. And I believe your family has been wronged. That's why I'm doing this." Sheila's eyes filled with tears. "But your career? The risks you're taking?" Whitman interrupted gently. "Some things are more important than a career. Your family deserves justice, and I'm determined to see that you get it." Sheila's voice faltered as she asked, "Do you really believe my husband is innocent?" Whitman leaned forward, his voice steady. "Yes, I do. I've found evidence that suggests he was wrongfully convicted, including a witness who has come forward to share the truth. I know it's hard to trust after everything you've been through, but I promise you, I'm doing everything in my power to make this right." Tears streamed down Sheila's face as she listened to his words. Years of disappointment and struggle had eroded her ability to hope, but Whitman's unwavering determination sparked something within her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Whitman placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that I'm on your side, and I won't stop until we've exhausted every option." Sheila left Judge Whitman's office with a sense of cautious hope. It wasn't the full relief she longed for, but for the first time in years, she felt she wasn't alone in her fight. Naomi's tiny hand gripped hers as they walked home. "Mommy," Naomi asked, her voice soft but curious, "do you think the judge can really bring Daddy back home?" Sheila hesitated, her throat tightening. She knelt down, meeting her daughter's wide, questioning eyes. "I think he's trying, sweetie," she replied carefully, "and that means we need to keep trying too." Naomi nodded, her little face serious beyond her years. Meanwhile, back in his chambers, Judge Whitman stared at the crumpled letter from the district attorney's office. The rejection of the request to retry Mr. Thomas's case stung deeply. He had poured hours of work into building a compelling argument, only for it to be dismissed as insufficient evidence. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the setback, leaning back in his chair and closing his eyes. But the thought of Sheila and Naomi, of the injustices they had endured, reignited his resolve. He refused to let this be the end of the road. The next morning, Whitman reached out to Lila Jenkins, an investigative journalist he had known for years. "Lila," he began cautiously when she answered, "I need your help." He laid out the story, detailing the inconsistencies in the case and the troubling patterns of bias he had uncovered. Lila listened intently, her sharp instincts immediately kicking in. "This is a big story, Richard," she said. "But going public like this, are you sure you're ready for the fallout?" Whitman sighed. "It's not about me, Lila. It's about justice for the Thomas family. The system failed them, and it needs to be held accountable." Over the next week, Lila worked tirelessly, interviewing Sheila, reviewing court documents, and tracking down additional witnesses. She pieced together a detailed exposé that highlighted not only the flaws in Mr. Thomas's trial, but also the systemic issues plaguing similar cases. Whitman provided her with carefully curated evidence, walking a fine line to ensure he didn't overstep his ethical boundaries. When the article was finally published, it sent shockwaves through the community. The morning the story broke, Whitman arrived at the courthouse to find a swarm of reporters waiting for him. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust into his face as he made his way up the courthouse steps. "Judge Whitman, do you believe the justice system is fundamentally flawed?" one reporter called out. "Your Honor, are you prepared to face disciplinary action for your involvement in this case?" another shouted. Whitman paused briefly, his expression calm but firm. "I stand by my actions," he said simply. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks. Justice must come first." Inside the courthouse, reactions to the article were mixed. Some of Whitman's colleagues viewed his actions as a betrayal of the judicial code, while others quietly admired his courage. Judge Thomas Harrison, head of the Judicial Review Board, confronted Whitman in the hallway. "Richard, what were you thinking?" Harrison hissed, his face flushed with frustration. "You've put the entire court under scrutiny." Whitman met his gaze steadily. "The court should be scrutinized, Thomas, especially when it fails the people it's meant to protect." As the article gained traction, public outcry intensified. Protests erupted outside the district attorney's office, with activists demanding a full review of Mr. Thomas's case. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Systemic Bias" filled the streets. Sheila watched the growing movement with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Neighbors she had barely spoken to before showed up at her door with food, supplies, and words of encouragement. For the first time, she felt the tide turning in her favor. Naomi, too, felt the impact of the community's support. At school, her classmates treated her with newfound respect, asking questions about her dad and the judge who was fighting for her family. One day, during a class discussion about heroes, Naomi stood up and said boldly, "My hero is Judge Whitman. He's helping bring my daddy home." Her teacher, moved by Naomi's words, wrote a note to Sheila praising Naomi's resilience and maturity. Despite the mounting public pressure, the district attorney's office remained resistant. Their official response to Lila's article dismissed the allegations as unsubstantiated claims and reiterated their belief in the original conviction. Whitman, undeterred, continued to push forward. He worked closely with Cherry Chen, a passionate young lawyer who had taken on the Thomas case pro bono. Together, they reviewed every piece of evidence, leaving no stone unturned. One afternoon, as Whitman and Cherry sat in his office, a breakthrough came. Cherry had uncovered a previously overlooked DNA sample from the crime scene. When she compared it to Mr. Thomas's DNA, it was clear they didn't match. Whitman felt a surge of hope. "This could change everything," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Cherry nodded, her eyes alight with determination. "It's not just about proving Mr. Thomas's innocence," she said. "It's about exposing the flaws in the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Armed with the new evidence, Cherry filed a motion for a retrial. This time, the court could not ignore the compelling argument she presented. The motion was granted, and a date was set for Mr. Thomas's retrial. The news sent waves of relief and excitement through the Thomas family. Sheila hugged Naomi tightly when she heard the news, her tears of joy soaking into her daughter's hair. "We're getting closer," she whispered. "Daddy's coming home." The retrial itself was a tense and emotional affair. Cherry presented the new evidence with precision and passion, systematically dismantling the prosecution's original case. The alternate suspect, whose DNA matched the crime scene sample, was identified and questioned, further exonerating Mr. Thomas. Sheila sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding as the evidence piled up. Naomi clutched her hand, her small fingers trembling with anticipation. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, "Not guilty," the courtroom erupted in applause. Sheila sobbed openly, clutching Naomi as the weight of years of injustice lifted from their shoulders. Mr. Thomas, now a free man, turned to his family with tears streaming down his face. Naomi ran into his arms, her laughter and cries of joy filling the room. "Daddy, you're home!" she exclaimed, her voice ringing with pure happiness. Outside the courthouse, supporters and reporters gathered to witness the family's reunion. Sheila, Darren, and Naomi stood together, holding hands as cameras flashed around them. Whitman watched from a distance, a sense of quiet fulfillment washing over him. His career, his reputation, none of it mattered in this moment. What mattered was the smiling family before him, finally free. After the emotional verdict, the air outside the courthouse buzzed with excitement and relief. Supporters erupted into cheers as Sheila clung to Darren, holding him as if she could make up for the years they had lost. Naomi bounced up and down with uncontainable joy, her laughter a bright beacon in the midst of the crowd. Standing at a distance, Judge Whitman observed quietly, his heart swelling with quiet satisfaction. While he had played a pivotal role in this moment, he knew the day belonged to the Thomas family. Darren scooped Naomi into his arms, his tear-filled eyes glistening in the late afternoon light. "I'm home, baby girl," he said, his voice breaking as he kissed her forehead. Naomi wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, her small voice echoing in his ear. "I missed you so much, Daddy." Sheila turned toward Judge Whitman, catching his eye through the crowd, and gestured for him to come closer. For a moment, Whitman hesitated. But then, as Sheila's expression softened with gratitude, he stepped forward. Sheila took his hands in hers, gripping them tightly as tears streamed down her face. "There are no words to thank you for what you've done for us, Judge Whitman," she said, her voice trembling. "You gave us back our family. You believed in us when no one else did." Whitman nodded solemnly, his eyes meeting hers with quiet understanding. "Your strength as a family," he replied gently, "is what made all the difference. I just helped where I could." Turning to Darren, Whitman's voice grew firmer. "It's been a long road, but now a new journey begins. Make the most of this second chance, not just for yourself, but for your wife and daughter." Darren nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "I will," he promised, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I'll make it right for them. I'll do whatever it takes." As the crowd began to thin, Whitman slipped away, leaving the Thomases to enjoy their reunion in peace. But his mind lingered on their journey, the battles they had fought and the system that had failed them so profoundly. He knew their story wasn't just an isolated case. It was a symptom of deeper, systemic issues that demanded attention. The next day, Darren, Sheila, and Naomi returned to their small apartment. Though it was still modest, it felt like a sanctuary now that they were together again. Darren moved through the space slowly, taking in every detail, as if reacquainting himself with a life he'd been forced to leave behind. Naomi followed him closely, chattering nonstop about all the things she wanted to show him. "Daddy, look, I still have the picture I drew for you," she said, holding up a crayon drawing of their family. Darren knelt down to her level, his heart aching as he studied the drawing. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said softly. "You've got real talent." Meanwhile, Sheila busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. She glanced over her shoulder at Darren and Naomi, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and hope. For years, she had shouldered the burden of raising Naomi alone, struggling to make ends meet. Now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't alone. The weight of the world had eased just enough to let her breathe. As the Thomases began rebuilding their lives, Judge Whitman faced his own challenges. The Judicial Review Board's investigation into his conduct had intensified following the publication of Lila Jenkins's exposé. Critics accused him of overstepping his boundaries, of letting personal bias interfere with his duties. Whitman, however, stood firm in his convictions. He knew the risks he had taken, but he also knew the impact his actions had made. Support for Whitman began to grow within the community. Letters poured into the courthouse, thanking him for his compassion and courage. Local activists organized rallies, holding signs that read "Justice with Humanity" and "Thank you, Judge Whitman." Even some of his colleagues, initially critical of his actions, began to soften their stance. Judge Patricia Harding, who had once warned him about the dangers of his involvement, approached him in the courthouse hallway one afternoon. "Richard," she said, her tone hesitant but genuine, "I didn't think I'd ever say this, but you were right. What you did for the Thomas family, it's what justice is supposed to look like." Whitman gave a small, tired smile. "Justice isn't always about following the rules to the letter," he replied. "Sometimes it's about remembering why those rules exist in the first place." Patricia nodded, a look of quiet respect crossing her face. "Well, you've certainly reminded all of us of that." Meanwhile, Darren faced the challenges of reintegration with quiet determination. Finding stable work proved difficult at first. Despite his exoneration, many employers hesitated to take a chance on him. But Darren refused to let the rejections discourage him. He spent hours filling out applications, attending interviews, and networking with anyone who would listen. Eventually, his persistence paid off. A local contractor, Tom Grayson, offered him a job as a carpenter's apprentice. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Tom said, shaking Darren's hand. "Let's see what you can do." Darren threw himself into the work with everything he had. His days were long and physically demanding, but he welcomed the challenge. At night, he returned home to the warm smiles of Sheila and Naomi, their little apartment filled with laughter and the smell of home-cooked meals. Each day felt like a step closer to normalcy, a life where the shadows of the past grew fainter. Sheila, too, found new purpose. Her experience working at the Springfield Food Bank had opened doors she never expected. Ellen, the coordinator, invited her to take on a leadership role, overseeing new programs designed to support single parents and families in crisis. Sheila hesitated at first, unsure if she was up to the task. But with encouragement from Ellen and her family, she accepted the position. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. For the first time in years, Sheila felt like she was making a difference, not just for her own family but for others like them. Naomi flourished in this new chapter of their lives. With her father home and her mother thriving, she became more confident and outgoing. She excelled in school, her teachers often praising her creativity and determination. One afternoon, Naomi surprised her parents by announcing that she'd been chosen to give a speech at her school's Family Day event. "I'm going to talk about how our family is like a superhero team," she said proudly, "because we never gave up, no matter what." On the day of the event, Sheila and Darren sat in the school auditorium, their hearts swelling with pride as Naomi took the stage. "My family is my superhero team," she began, her voice clear and strong. "My mom is brave and strong. My dad never stopped fighting for us. And we had a real-life hero in Judge Whitman who believed in us when no one else did." The room erupted in applause as Naomi finished her speech, her smile lighting up the entire auditorium. As Naomi stepped off the stage, her parents enveloped her in a warm embrace. Darren held her close, whispering, "You were amazing, kiddo." "So brave." Sheila kissed the top of her daughter's head, her heart swelling with pride. For years, they had endured struggle after struggle, but in this moment, they were a family united, celebrating their resilience and newfound hope. Meanwhile, Judge Whitman's days were filled with both praise and scrutiny. The Judicial Review Board convened multiple hearings to evaluate his conduct. In each session, Whitman stood his ground, articulating the importance of balancing the law with humanity. "The law exists to serve justice," he told the board during one heated exchange. "And justice without compassion is no justice at all." His words resonated with some members, though others remained skeptical, questioning whether his actions had crossed ethical boundaries. Outside the courthouse, the public's support for Whitman grew stronger. Letters of encouragement flooded his office, many from families who had faced similar struggles. One letter, written by a mother in a nearby town, read, "Because of you, I have hope that the system can change. You reminded us that people matter more than procedure." Whitman kept that letter in his desk drawer, drawing strength from it during the most difficult days. Darren's progress in his new job became a point of pride, not only for his family, but also for the community that had rallied behind him. His employer, Tom Grayson, quickly recognized Darren's natural skill and dedication. "You've got a real talent for this," Tom told him one afternoon as they worked side by side on a construction site. "If you keep it up, you'll have your own crew in no time." Darren beamed at the compliment, his confidence growing with each passing day. At home, Sheila and Darren worked together to create a sense of stability and normalcy for Naomi. They turned their modest apartment into a haven of love and laughter, a stark contrast to the years of fear and uncertainty they had endured. Even simple moments like cooking dinner together or helping Naomi with her homework felt like victories. "It's the little things," Sheila often said to Darren as they tucked Naomi into bed. "These are the moments that make it all worth it." Naomi, now thriving in school and brimming with confidence, began to dream about the future in ways she hadn't before. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, she announced, "When I grow up, I want to be a lawyer, like the one who helped Daddy." Darren and Sheila exchanged a look of pride and surprise. "You'd make a great lawyer," Darren said, reaching over to ruffle her hair. "You're already smart and brave. The rest is just practice." While the Thomases rebuilt their lives, Judge Whitman continued to push for broader reform. Inspired by the outcome of the Thomas case, he worked with advocacy groups to review other wrongful convictions. His dedication sparked conversations in legal circles about the need for systemic change. "Justice doesn't end with a verdict," Whitman said during a panel discussion at a legal conference. "It requires constant vigilance and a willingness to challenge the status quo." The attention surrounding Whitman's work began to attract national media coverage. Journalists highlighted his efforts to balance the rigidity of the law with the humanity of those it was meant to serve. A documentary team reached out asking to feature him in a series about reform-minded judges. At first, Whitman was hesitant, wary of appearing self-promotional, but after careful consideration, he agreed, hoping the project would inspire others to rethink the role of compassion in the justice system. As the documentary aired, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Viewers were moved by Whitman's humility and the profound impact of his work. The segment on the Thomas family was particularly poignant, showing footage of Darren's release and Naomi's heartfelt speech about her superhero family. Messages of support poured in from across the country, with many viewers expressing a newfound respect for the complexities of justice. Despite the growing acclaim, Whitman remained grounded. He continued to face challenges, including pushback from those who viewed his methods as controversial, but the stories of families like the Thomases fueled his determination. He often revisited their case file, not out of necessity but as a reminder of why he had taken this path. For Whitman, their journey symbolized the potential for redemption and the power of standing up for what was right. One afternoon, several months after Darren's exoneration, the Thomases paid a surprise visit to Whitman's home. Naomi carried a bouquet of flowers, while Sheila and Darren each held trays of food. When Whitman opened the door, his stern courtroom demeanor gave way to a warm smile. "What's all this?" he asked, stepping aside to let them in. "We wanted to thank you properly," Sheila explained, setting the tray down on the dining table. "You've done so much for us, and we wanted to show our appreciation." Darren added, "You didn't just give me back my freedom. You gave us back our family. That's something we can never repay, but we can at least share a meal with you." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily. Naomi eagerly shared stories about school, while Darren and Sheila spoke about their plans for the future. Whitman listened with genuine interest, his heart swelling with pride as he saw how far they had come. By the end of the evening, the Thomases had become more than just a case he had worked on. They were a reminder of the profound impact one act of compassion could have. In the months that followed, the changes sparked by Whitman's actions began to ripple through the community. Local organizations collaborated to create new resources for families in crisis, including free legal clinics and expanded food bank services. The Springfield Food Bank, where Sheila continued to work, saw a surge in donations and volunteers. Sheila's leadership played a key role in these efforts, her first-hand experience lending authenticity and urgency to her advocacy. Darren, now a lead carpenter, took on mentorship roles within his company, helping young men who were at risk of falling into the same traps he had faced. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he often told them, echoing the sentiment that had given him hope during his darkest days. His dedication earned him the respect of his colleagues and the admiration of his family. Naomi, inspired by her family's journey and the example of Judge Whitman, continued to dream big. She joined her school's debate team, where she excelled at crafting persuasive arguments. During one competition, she delivered a speech titled "Justice with Compassion," dedicating it to Whitman. Her words left the audience in awe, earning her a standing ovation and a first-place trophy. For Whitman, the legacy of the Thomas case extended far beyond the courtroom. It had reshaped his understanding of justice, deepening his commitment to a more compassionate approach. As he prepared to retire from the bench, he reflected on the lessons he had learned and the lives he had touched. The Thomases, in particular, held a special place in his heart, a testament to the transformative power of doing what was right, even in the face of adversity. On the day of his retirement, Judge Whitman stood before a packed courtroom for the final time. Colleagues, community members, and even former defendants he had sentenced filled the room, their faces a mix of gratitude and respect. Among them sat the Thomas family front and center. Darren and Sheila held hands, their expressions calm but emotional, while Naomi sat between them, clutching a handmade card she had insisted on bringing. Whitman cleared his throat and looked out at the crowd. "When I began my career, I believed justice was a matter of following the law to the letter," he began, his voice steady but reflective. "Over the years, I've learned that justice is so much more than that. It's about listening, truly listening to the people who come before us. It's about seeing their humanity and understanding their struggles." His eyes landed on the Thomases, and he smiled. "I learned this most profoundly from one case, a mother, a daughter, and a family fighting against impossible odds. Their courage reminded me why I took this oath in the first place. Justice is not about perfection. It's about compassion. It's about striving to do what's right, even when it's difficult." The room erupted in applause as Whitman stepped down from the bench for the final time. Sheila, Darren, and Naomi stood with the rest of the crowd, clapping loudly as Whitman approached them. Naomi ran up to him, handing him her card. "For you, Mr. Judge," she said, her smile radiant. Whitman opened the card, his heart swelling as he read the words, "Thank you for being our hero." After the ceremony, the Thomas family joined Whitman for a small gathering at the Springfield Food Bank, a place that had become a cornerstone of their story. Ellen, the coordinator, stood near the entrance, greeting guests with her characteristic warmth. Volunteers, activists, and community leaders mingled, sharing stories and celebrating the changes that had blossomed in the wake of Whitman's decisions. Sheila stood near a table laden with food, watching as Naomi pulled Whitman toward a group of children. "She's taken quite a liking to him," Ellen said, approaching with a smile. "It's no surprise, though. He's the reason she still has her dad." Sheila nodded, her eyes misting as she looked at Darren, who was deep in conversation with a group of young men. "He changed everything for us," she said softly. "We were drowning, and he pulled us out. I'll never forget that." As the evening wound down, Whitman found a quiet moment to reflect. He stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face. The courthouse loomed in the distance, its familiar silhouette a reminder of the life he was leaving behind. Yet, he felt no regret, only a deep sense of fulfillment. His time on the bench had been meaningful, but his greatest achievement had been finding the courage to act when it mattered most. Darren joined him a few moments later, standing silently at his side. After a long pause, Darren spoke. "Judge Whitman, I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you, but I can promise you this. I'm going to make the most of this second chance, for my family and for myself." Whitman nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Darren's shoulder. "That's all I could ever hope for," he said simply. Inside, Naomi called out for Whitman, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "Mr. Judge, we're cutting the cake." Whitman chuckled, glancing at Darren before heading back inside. The warmth of the room enveloped him as he returned to the celebration. The Thomas family, the volunteers, and everyone who had been touched by this journey gathered around the table, their faces glowing with hope and camaraderie. As the knife sliced through the cake, a cheer erupted, and Naomi insisted on handing Whitman the first slice. "Because you deserve it," she declared, her grin lighting up the room. Whitman accepted the plate with a smile, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the moment. Years later, Naomi would follow through on her dream of becoming a lawyer, using her family's story as inspiration to fight for others. Darren and Sheila would continue their work in the community, helping families who, like theirs, needed a hand to steady them. And Judge Whitman, though retired, would remain a symbol of justice tempered with humanity, a legacy that would inspire generations to come. As the evening wound to a close and the crowd began to disperse, Whitman stood by the door, watching the Thomas family laugh together. He felt a profound sense of peace. Justice, he thought, isn't just about the laws we write. It's about the lives we touch. And tonight, surrounded by hope and joy, he knew he had done his part.